Okay, so let's try this again. If I pull up this size class menu and we look at compact width regular height, then this is for all iPhones in portrait mode. So this is when so basically you kind of want to use any width, any height, because that's what you would do if you're designing a generic app that you kind of want it to look the same, no matter the orientation and no matter the device you're using. But say you want your app to look different in portrait mode than you do in landscape mode. So then you'll want to use different size classes and different constraints within those size classes. So say you'll use compact width regular height for portrait, and then any width with compact height for a landscape, and you can add different things in each of those size classes and define them separately. Do we have any questions about size classes? So I just want to move on to sort of like briefly before we talk about constraints, to let everyone know that this is a really difficult subject, or it's a really difficult thing to sort of master, and you end up having to play around with constraints for a long time before you get the hang of it. So I just want to tell everyone that there's no need to be discouraged. You just have to really keep trying and working at it, and then you sort of get the hang of it after a while. So there's actually two ways to create constraints. The one that we're going to be using is Interface Builder, but you can also create constraints programmatically. So we're going to focus mainly on Interface Builder, and we're going to talk about sort of three different ways. One of the ways, and this is the first one that we'll show you, is to use guidelines. So I've pasted or sort of dragged five different labels into this view controller, and I didn't align them in any specific way. I just sort of dragged them in. But you'll notice that if I drag the first label up to the corner, there's these blue guidelines that sort of show up, and they have default values away from the edges of your view, your super view. So when you put a label or any sort of UI element and snap them to these blue guidelines, it doesn't exactly create the constraints, but it sort of shows you where it tells auto layout. Sorry, it tells Interface Builder where you intend to create the constraints. So if I snap this to the top grid, the top layout guideline, and the right layout guideline, and also these three blue lines align it with the label 1. So I'm using label 2, and I'm aligning it now with label 1 as well as the top and the right edge. It's also aligned with label 4. So let's move label 4 down, align it. Let's do label 3 because we have label 1 already in place, the place that we want it to be. We're going to snap it to this area. Now we're going to do label 4 and sort of do the same thing. So these three lines align it with the left edge of label 2, the center of label 2, and the right edge of label 2. So now all four of these should be the default values away from the edges. We're going to move this label 5 to the center. So these blue lines show the center of the view, vertical and horizontal. And now that we have these all snapped like to these areas, we can click on reset to suggested constraints, and these will put in the constraints that we have yet to implement. So it doesn't look like anything has changed, but now the constraints are in place. So if we were to look and preview this, which you can do by clicking the Assistant Editor and clicking on Preview. So now you have all these labels, stuck to their edges in the center, as well as, so for label 5, we see that it's actually not stuck to the center. So it looks like we're missing some sort of constraint here. So let's take a look, and we can do this by looking at the constraints in the document outline. So this looks like I'm just going to move this out this way. Okay, so we have, that constraint is there, this constraint is there, but we don't seem to have any constraint for the vertical center for label 5. So let's create that. See, so we're going to center vertically in container, and we're also going to,
That should be good.
yeah. So
you have an additional constraint.
so what we have, we had an additional constraint that was pushing it down. I see. So this is this is what we call a magic number. This constraint is setting it, the vertical space, to be, 269. So that was pushing it down to the bottom. Those things are like those are like not really great when you're creating this, because you don't want like absolute values usually, because that sort of dictates a specific look for a certain orientation. So usually you want to use the centers. But we have a new question.
Hi, we have several questions, and just for our viewers, I will be getting to the questions at the logical point in the presentation where the question needs to be answered. So please be patient. I am looking at your questions. The first question is from Leo Picardo. He says, how to debug constraints? Every now and then I'll get a cryptic error on my log saying a constraint was dropped, but the app runs fine and Interface Builder shows no errors.
Great question. So oftentimes that happens when you have an additional constraint. So notice in the previous example, we had a constraint which centered the label vertically, but we also had a constraint that was pushing the label down.
Right.
And so when that happens, Xcode will often try to warn you that where the label is actually going to be placed at runtime is different than what you intend for it to be placed. And that's when you know that there's a problem, and that's when you have to go back, just like Eden did, and try to remove the constraint that's causing it.
Right. Sometimes, clicking on set to suggested constraints, it works really well, but it's also just suggested, and so like it doesn't necessarily put the constraints in that you had really intended. For instance, like maybe label 5 hadn't actually been aligned and stuck to these blue guidelines, and so potentially a constraint was set that I didn't actually intend to be there.
Right. So
you always have to really double check.
Right.
We have another question.
This is from John Maldia, who wants to know, how did the 269 get added there?
So I think it was, I don't remember adding it. I don't think I did, but I think it potentially, so what I think happened was that maybe this label 5 was not exactly snapped to these grid lines, so that if it was over here and I clicked on suggest, reset to suggested constraints, so watch what happens when I click it now. It's going to create constraints that are just kind of, it's doing the best it can. It's saying like, oh, you want it to be center, so let's make this absolute, let's make it 277 pixels, from the bottom, and let's make it 267 pixels from the left, because like it seems that that's where you want it for some reason. So, that's what the suggested constraints just create. We have another question.
A student wants to know, will this be recorded for later viewing? Babs Lee asks, and the answer is yes, it will be.
Definitely.
The next question, which is about constraints, is from Abhijit Majumdar, who asks, what are some use cases where we would want to add constraints in code as opposed to storyboard?
Sure. So that doesn't actually happen very much anymore because of how powerful storyboards have gotten. But when you want to create custom user interface elements, for example, you want to create like a circular progress bar or something, that's when you have to specify these constraints in code instead of defining absolute frames for these new views to be.
Right. There's one other thing I want to show you before I give the mic to Ayush. So say we hadn't used those blue guidelines, and I had just placed this, and I thought it was in the center, but for some reason I didn't use the blue guidelines. So these like temporary sort of, they're not constraints, but they show up as, oh, actually no. So what happens is if you move the label around and you have these constraints in place, so moving a label doesn't change your constraints. Like if you move the element, the constraints still stay the same, but it's gonna give you a warning that says like this doesn't look right, and that's why these lines are now in orange. So the other thing that happens is in your outline, you get a little button here that's also orange in the top left, in the top right corner next to view controller scene. So this is telling you like something's not right. So you can click on it, and it says, and if we click on this little triangle, it's telling us that we can do these suggested things to maybe make this right. So we can update constraints to fit to make new constraints for where the label is, or we can update the frame to set the label to match where the constraints should be. So let's click on update frame, and it snaps it back into the place that it should be. So label 5 goes back to where the constraints say that it should be, and now they're blue again. We have another question, it looks like.
This is from Omar Albeek, who wants to know, can I drag constraints from storyboard to a view controller file and set them as ID outlets and then change their properties programmatically? And how to animate the change?
There is a way to work with constraints in your view controller in the code, but do you know if you can?
So I don't know of a way to do it with an IB outlet, but constraints are animatable. We won't be covering that in this webcast, but if you have questions about that, feel free to post in the discussion forums.
Yeah, that's a whole other topic that we could talk about, like working with them in code, and you can change them. But go ahead, we have another question.
Gil Ferreira asks, how often do you just get rid of constraints and start over? Is that a normal issue? I've had to do that a few times so far.
I would say it's definitely a normal issue. Happens a lot. Sometimes you end up making a lot of constraints, and you don't know if you necessarily need them by the end. And sometimes it helps. Like for instance, in that first part where I had a constraint that was pushing it down, if I hadn't found it, because say I had 5 times as many constraints, and sometimes it's the other thing about the outline is that you can sort of click through them and highlight what's what, like which constraints are which is also really helpful. But say you didn't want to do that, or maybe you thought you had too many and they weren't all useful. Clearing constraints is a really good place to sort of restart, and I'd say it's definitely normal. Let's take another question, and then I think we should move on to the align and pin menus.
Okay, this is from Omar Albeek again. What's the difference between set top space to top layout and vertical spacing?
Set top space
to top layout.
And vertical spacing.
Okay, so vertical spacing usually takes place between 2 views, whereas set top to top layout usually takes place between 1 view and the top view of the super view.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, if you wanted to line the label to the very top of the super view, then you would use the set to top layout. Otherwise, if you wanted to, say label 3 is 200 pixels from label 1, that's when you would use the vertical spacing.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit more about the different menu options that we have here. Take it away, Ayush.
Sure. Let's swap computers real quick.
Great.
So we looked at, I guess, an automated way of doing constraints, and that was by adding missing constraints or resetting to suggested constraints. But now let's take a look at another one. So to do that, we're just going to clear all the constraints first. So we have a blank canvas to start with. The first menu we'll look at is called the Align menu. And the Align menu lets us create alignment constraints, which include centering different views in their container. For example, we want label 5 to be centered within our super view here. So we want to put it horizontally in the center and vertically in the center. And so we would use this alignment tool to do that.
One other thing I would add just to that is that these little numbers here, which I was confused about at first when I first saw them, those are offsets. So you can actually, if you don't want it to be exactly in the center, you can suggest an offset. You know, this says 0 because we do want it to be in the center, but you can offset it by 1 or however many you want.
Absolutely. So we're just going to update the frame. So this is, we'll just move that back to the center. Another thing we can do with alignment constraints, or with the alignment tool, is aligning different edges. So right now, if we just create or click on one label, notice we can't click on any of these. These are all disabled.
Right.
So if we select multiple labels, for example, we want the X position, so the distance from the left side of this view controller, and these labels to be the same. And so to do that,
Okay, you're back.
okay, similarly, we want label 1 and label 2.
Sorry, I need you to join the webcast again because the server error. Hang on, let me invite you.
That's okay. Go back.
You're back.
Okay. We cut out quickly for a minute, but we're going to be back in a second. In a jiffy.
Just desktop.
Okay.
Is your video camera off for some reason? Ah, there you go. Okay, we're back.
Should be back. Great. So now we want to align label 1 and label 2 to the top. And so to do that, all we're going to do is select both label 1 and label 2, select the top edge, and specify our constraint. Likewise, we want label 2 and label 4 to be the same distance from the right edge, so we will click both of them and select trailing edge this time. And then to finish it all off, we want label 3 and label 4 the same distance from the bottom. And bam, we have our constraints. So these aren't a complete set of constraints, but what they do allow us to do is specify if we want something in the corner, and if we have multiple views, for instance, how to line them up properly. So that was the alignment menu. The next menu we'll look at is the pin menu. And for that, we have another example prepared. So to start off with, I'm just going to clear all the constraints from here. Useful for creating spacing constraints, which means you could specify the height of a particular view or the distance from one view to another view. So to do this, we have this example which kind of replicates the Facebook app. So what we want to do at first is we want our cover photo to be aligned to the top. And what we want to do is we also want to preserve the aspect ratio, so the image isn't blurred when you rotate the device.
Do you want to explain aspect ratio just for
Sure.
really quickly?
So aspect ratio means that as we resize the image, the ratio of the width and the height remains the same. So for example, if we have a square and we select preserve the aspect ratio, what this does is that this view is always going to remain a square. Okay, so now we can add constraints to the top, left, and right edges. And we do this because we want the image to stick at the top of our view and also cover the entire width of the screen.
So that even if it changes, it'll still cover the top and the width of the screen.
Exactly.
No matter what, if you switch to landscape or if you have a bigger device, it'll still be the top and the width. So, as opposed to, being off the screen or shrinking, you want to pin it to the edges.
Right. So now you can see our image view. Because the aspect ratio is preserved, it's at the very top. So now the next thing we want to do is we want to constrain the toolbar. We want this toolbar to remain just under the image view. So we do the same thing again. We want to align it to the top of the toolbar. We align the side edges because we want the toolbar to take the entire width of the screen. It seems like we have a question.
Yes, this is from Babs Lee, who asks, how do we know what numbers to use? For example, the -16 or 0 or 444.
It's a good question.
That's a great question. So, Xcode suggests to us -16 because what we're doing is we're constraining it to margins. And this is just a tool that Apple has created for expanding the apps to different devices. But it might make more sense if we unselect this constraint to margins, and you'll see that all of these numbers convert right to 0. And that's the distance from the very right edge to the, I guess, the very right edge of the super view. I hope that answers your question. So likewise for the toolbar, what we've done is we've aligned it to the top, or we've pinned it to the top directly under the cover photo, and we've forced it to cover the entire width of the screen.
Also, if you guys have any follow-up questions, feel free to, if you're still having questions about what we explained, go ahead and ask another one. You're welcome to ask as many questions as you like. We want to make sure that everyone, gets a good understanding of constraints. Sorry to interrupt you.
Sure. So now our profile photo. So the profile photo is a little different because we want it to be the same across all devices. So one of the things we want to do is we want to pin the height and the width because we want the photo to be just as big across all our devices. Now, another thing we want to do is we want to pin it to the bottom of our toolbar. So as you can see, we want the image to be aligned towards the bottom of the image, but as this screen gets smaller, we want the image to go up. And so we've done just that. And we've also pinned the left edge, which means that our image isn't going to move from the X position it is in now. Bam. So now you can see our image view and our lovely profile, our duplicate, or our representation of the Facebook app.
Right.
Right there. If you ever want to change any of these constraints, for example, we might not want the image to be just this big. So we'll change it to 80 by 80. And it may fit better in our screens.
Yeah. So it looks like we have some more questions.
Yes, this one is from Shirley Han, who asks, is there a way to list the constraints associated with a particular object?
Yes, that's a great question.
Absolutely.
Let's
so if you look at the view, you'll notice that there are two sets of constraints. There's one constraint, which is...
Sorry, I just want to interrupt in case it wasn't clear. The view that we selected is the outermost view. So it has all the subviews contained inside of it.
Right. Okay. So each view has its own set of constraints. So if we open the image view first, you'll notice that the image view has a specific constraint. So this constraint only applies to the image view and nothing else. But let's say, for example, that we've pinned this image view to our super view. All of those constraints will appear under the super view's constraints like button. And you can toggle those to view all the constraints that apply to that particular view.
There's also another way to see, so say we clicked on our profile picture object. If we go over here to this right menu and we click on what is this menu one called again? I think it's the size. Oh yeah, the size inspector, right? Which it has the icon of a ruler. So if we look here, these are all the constraints associated with this profile picture view that's selected on the screen. So right now it shows the leading space to the super view. It shows the width. It shows the height and the bottom space to the toolbar. So it has all the constraints associated with this, even though if we look at it here in the document outline, it only has these two because those are specific to that, to just the profile picture view. And the other two constraints that were over here are listed under this more broad list of constraints which are associated with the super view and the profile picture view. Let's take another question.
We have a couple of related questions.
Great.
One is from Luis, who says, when I have a layout built in compact width for iPhones and I change to a general layout, any, and add a new button and go back to the compact view, my button disappears. Why? Are those layouts independent of each other? And the related question is from Ella, who asks, how to play with constraints to fit for different screen size, iPhone 5, 6, 6 Plus, etc.
Do you want to take the first one?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason why is when you're in any like control that you drag onto the screen will be shown in every single size class that you go to. But for example, if you drag a particular UI control to just one size class, you won't be able to see it in any other size class.
And this is because, from what I said in the beginning, that like say you wanted to define a different view, in orientation, in landscape mode versus portrait mode. So you wanted certain buttons to show up in portrait, but you didn't want those buttons to show up in landscape. That's why it does this. So when you select the size class that specifies landscape and you drag a button in, it's sort of assuming that you only want people to see that button in landscape.
Yeah.
And the next question was how to play with constraints to fit for different screen sizes.
Sure. So just like UI controls, you can also adjust constraints to fit one particular size class. So for example, here, if I wanted to set the height to be 60, I could do that just for this one size class.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And a question from buyers, from Jeannie Nicole Byers, is there any way to get the storyboard to look the way it will be presented? That's pretty much what we've been talking about.
So, but I see what you're saying. So one of the things that, you can start off by doing is, but it's kind of like, there's a catch to it. So if we were to delete all of these constraints and then, you have all, drag the views to where you want them to be and how you want it to look, you can click on the menu and click add missing constraints or even, reset to suggested constraints. And it'll put constraints into your layout to make it look exactly how it looks, on your screen, and it also show that way in preview. But there's a catch because, there's a lot of absolute values that it'll put in, and it doesn't necessarily look that way when you change the orientation. So you really have to look specifically at all of your constraints and make sure they're what you want. Okay, we have another question.
From Vikas, does ordering the components in a view and its constraints matter?
Does ordering the components in a view and its constraints?
They should not affect the constraints. I guess the only thing that might affect the constraints is the spacing between that view and the closest view to it. So if you had two UI elements on top of each other, for example, Xcode might get confused, but that's also a far shot.
How about the order of different constraints, if you have?
So the constraints are automatically ordered. You
Yeah,
can actually adjust the order in which they're called. Constraints do have something called priority. We won't be getting to that this time, but priority can also be adjusted.
From John Malia, what to do if you want to make the image as the profile image, your UI image view, resize?
So if you wanted to make it resize, if you wanted to resize it in general, or let's say we wanted just it to be a bigger size in general, and then the other way to interpret that question is maybe change the size of it in different orientations. Let's hit one at a time. So to resize it in general, I believe you can just change the size of it. So if you select the element and then delete the or change the constraints that are saying that it has to be this height and this width.
Right. Another way is to also change the size class. And I demonstrated this earlier, but different size classes can have different values for constraints. So if, for example, we're using an iPhone in portrait or landscape, that's one of the older iPhones, the image size will be 60 by 60 pixels versus the default image size of 80 by 80 pixels. So definitely use size classes to your advantage, and you can also adjust constraints to do that.
We have another question. Let's keep
That's
going.
again.
This is good.
Is there a map or coordinates for the numbers from the side of the screen?
Yeah, so you can actually see that. Xcode sets up different values for the margins. So for example, if I wanted to add a control here, this is what Xcode defines as 0, 0. So this is from the margin of the screen, this is 0 pixels in both the X and the Y coordinate.
That's really good to know, because the person that also asked the question earlier about what is the -16 and what is 0. So it's kind of like the margins of a paper, you know, when you were typing in like a Google Doc or, you know, a document, you have the margins, and where the text starts is at 0, 0. So it's the same thing with this.
And if you want to avoid using those margins, you can just unselect the constraints to margins, and you should be able to enter the values that I guess make a little more common sense.
We got another question.
Bill
Let's hear it.
Pereira asks, how much time is typically spent setting up storyboard? Are typically different positions, or is the iOS developer responsible for both?
I haven't done that much programmatic many programmatic constraints. I'd say I at least know from, you know, using Interface Builder that it does take time to sort of get your layout to look the way you want it to, and I would definitely suggest making, you know, maybe drawing it out on paper or something, or making, you know, using Paint to like a program just to display exactly how you want your layout to look before starting to build constraints, and that definitely helps, but it does take time. Do you know more about doing it programmatically?
So even programmers will generally be responsible for laying out the constraints on a storyboard, just because it's so much easier than typing in all the constraints programmatically. So as you get more accustomed to it, you'll begin to spend more time programming and less time designing the interface. But for now, it's okay to be spending even 50% of your time just working on getting accustomed to constraints. It's something that even experienced programmers struggle with, and it's something we make mistakes on all the time. But
yeah, it's really important to not get discouraged, because it is, you know, confusing and troubling at times. Do you have any follow-up questions from, you know, I just hope we explained the answers to questions. Okay, let's see. It looks like we have some pretty specific questions. Are any of them, you know, specific to the example that we're giving? Let's see if we can take maybe one in the time that we have left. And let's see.
One from Ella is about collection views. For project 2, I found difficulties aligning the cells to look nice. Any ideas for dealing with collection views?
I guess the important thing to keep in mind is that each collection view cell is like designing its own view.
Right.
So when you do the constraints for one cell, it's just sandboxed in that one little area. So
that's one thing that we didn't get time to talk about in this webcast, but you can essentially have, you know, a view, you know, a container view that you put inside of your super view that also has, you know, its own subviews, and you can move that around. So that's another way to, you know, deal with, say we had a, you know, if we had a much more complicated layout here, having a container view is really helpful in aligning, you know, the elements the way that you want them to look. Let's take another question and then start to wrap up.
This is the last question we have. Can you show an example with UI WebView and a PDF document? The issue is that Swift put other views on top of the web view that you can't manage. I couldn't set the PDF to fill the whole screen. There were all these margins on the left and the right created by those views.
That's a pretty specific question.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's specific to UI WebView. There are different properties in UI WebView, and make sure to read the documentation about filling the screen with the current web page.
Last question that we can tackle is, do you know if we can use snapshots to undo experiments with constraints?
I think snapshots encapsulate everything, don't they? If you have a snapshot of your project, then it contains everything.
Sure. So the answer is you probably could, although we'd suggest using GitHub to manage different, tests with constraints.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have time for one more question?
Let's try. We have about 5 minutes left, so this will be the last question we can take. But I want to encourage you to continue to ask questions, and we can answer them on the forum. So if you have questions, if you're someone that is going to tune into this webcast later on, ask your questions on the forums, and we'll definitely get to everyone. So let's hear the last question for now.
A simpler question. I missed how you brought up the interface preview. How do I bring up the preview?
Oh, great.
Sure. So let's start with how a storyboard usually looks. What you can do is open up the assistant editor. It's one of the 3 little buttons on the top right. Once you open up the assistant editor, what you want to do is click on this little icon. It's right next to the forward button.
And it has 2 little circles, and usually it's going to show up with automatic. So
it'll usually show up like this.
Yeah.
But what you can do is click on these 2 little circles and press on preview, and you'll get a preview of an iPhone, and you can add more previews depending on what device you would like to see.
Yep, it's a really useful tool. So that way you don't have to run your app every time. That's about all the time we have. We just want to let you know that we're going to have webcasts in the future. We might tackle constraints again because there's really a lot to talk about. We could talk about it for hours and hours. Another thing that I just wanted to hit quickly is that you can use the drag and click, and you can essentially do the same things you can with the align and pin menus. Say if you control click on an element and drag it to another element, you have the option of selecting a relative constraint between the 2 elements. So you can say that you want to align the 2 left edges. You can click left, and that would, it doesn't quite work for this example, so maybe we should try on the other one. Say for these 2 buttons, I'm going to control drag from the label 3 to label 1, and they're already aligned to the left. So this little dot is here saying that these are both aligned to the left. But now I say I want to do a vertical spacing between them. So I'll click vertical spacing, and this is going to, indicate that these labels label 1 is going to stay on top of label 3, no matter what the orientation. There's one other constraint that we're missing here.
There are a few other constraints we're missing.
Let's see. So let's try using the, so we have this button indicating that it's orange. We're going to use this tool that we learned about earlier. Well, we sort of messed around with this, so there's a couple, there's a bunch of things that we could fix, but, let's see if you guys can recreate this and try it yourselves, because these are, this is a really good way, playing around with it is a really good way to learn. But yeah, I just wanted to let you know that that's another option you have, is to use this menu as well. I think that's about all the time we have. So definitely keep asking your questions, and also if you have ideas for future webcasts, that's a good thing to write in about. And yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. Do you have anything else to add?
Keep working hard on the constraints. just a little more trial and error, and you'll be good to go in no time. So we'll see you on the forums and in office hours. But for now, good night.
Yeah.